Welcome to the Safety Doc Podcast with your charismatic host and prominent safety expert, Dr. David Perrodin. Be entertained and informed as the Safety Doc discusses both best and bizarre practices in safety preparation and crisis response. The truth will keep you safe. Follow Dr. Perrodin on Twitter at SafetyPhD.
Hi, everybody. This is David, and welcome to the Safety Doc Podcast. You know, I had to think a little bit about what to use today for the title of today's show. The first title was Sooner or Later, Everyone Fails, the 238-day threshold of World War II military psychiatry. But, you know, I ditched that and instead went with what one question predicted emotional breakdown better than any other. So as you can kind of tell, we're going to talk today largely about an article published by John Apple in 1999 in the American Heritage magazine. John Apple was a psychiatrist in the military during World War II and also a researcher of battle fatigue. So let's start out today with a few anecdotes. My first anecdote is, you know what, we've had a string of kind of severe weather here in southern Wisconsin lately, and I was thinking back to my college days. One of my friends that lived in my college town had graduated a couple of years before I did, and bought a home in the town, actually outside of town. So he bought a home outside of town, and whenever there was severe weather, okay, you know, they would sound the tornado sirens. Well, nowadays they kind of urge you to purchase those weather radios, and they kind of have done away with tornado sirens, at least in Wisconsin. I mean, they're still here, but if you're rural, especially, they're saying, you know, purchase these weather radios, and then they'll sound the alarm if there's severe weather in your area. But, you know, so we're talking back in maybe 1994, 95-ish. So my friend, who lived outside of town, whenever severe weather would come through, and there was like this group of homes, maybe like 10, 12 homes in his, there was like a little subdivision along, the Wisconsin River. And, anyway, severe weather would come through, and it was before they had the storm radios, and, you couldn't hear the town or the city. There was a nearby city, you know, just a few miles away, but you couldn't hear the sirens. So, you know, when I grew up, whenever there was severe weather, they would do the siren. And that would be your indication that, you know, either there was a, you know, very severe weather, tornado, and you needed to head downstairs. Now, the house that I grew up in actually had a bomb shelter built into it. It was built in the 60s, the home, and had, like this 18-inch thick walls, ceiling, you know, blast door, the whole deal built into this house. My parents did, you know, since move from that house, but yeah, you didn't have to worry about a tornado too much when you could go downstairs into the blast shelter. But anyway, so my friend, you know, from college decided that he was going to take on the role of alerting everybody in the neighborhood when there was a severe thunderstorm or a tornado warning. So what he did, so he went to a flea market, a large flea market, and bought an air raid siren that somebody, you know, must have claimed off of, you know, some municipal building. This thing was probably from the 40s or 50s or whatever. So he bought this and takes this air raid siren. And the guy's, okay, to make the story kind of make sense, the guy is an electrician by trade. That's what he does. So he has this tower, you know, the antenna towers, like, you know, you saw these more in the country than in the city, but antenna towers before satellite dishes, and they would go up, and then they'd have your little, you know, multi-prong thing on top that would get your television reception and stuff like that. Well, anyway, he had one of these in his backyard, and the thing went up probably, you know, like 50 feet. So what he did is he mounted this siren on this pole. Again, he's an electrician, so it's professionally done. so this siren is up maybe, 40 feet. And he takes it upon himself then, okay, to activate this siren and this air raid siren, it's a tornado siren basically, whenever there's really severe weather or a tornado warning for his area. Now, whatever township he lives in, and I don't know the rules and regulations. I'm assuming it's kind of frowned upon to take that into your own, hands of putting up an air raid siren on your own property and kind of activating it per your discretion. But he's done that for the last 20 years. Still does it today. Like I saw him not too long ago, and I'm like, yeah, there's the air raid siren. Still use it? Yes, I do. Yes, I do. Somebody has to. And apparently his neighbors appreciate it. I don't know if anybody said anything, but, very interesting, but yeah, only activates it when there is, and now the Doppler radar stuff has gotten so sophisticated that it can almost zoom in, when they go on TV, like to your street, like it's going to hit on your street, like, heavy hail in 2 minutes or whatever. So, but I have to laugh a little bit because it's one of those things when he initially did it, I thought, ooh, this'll last maybe 2 or 3 times he'll do this, and then someone will report him, or the township will say, like, no, you have to take that down. But 20 years strong, and I'm guessing it'll probably keep going. So I want to thank Larry Roberts, the host of Readily Random podcast, for having me as a guest on his podcast last week. So it is episode 14. You can go to readilyrandom.com, readilyrandom.com. And Larry does a very extensive workup for all of his guests. And I commend. I mean, he did a lot of work ahead of time gathering information about projects I had participated in, and very, very thorough. It was one of the best interviews or discussions, I guess, that I've participated in through podcast or radio. And lately I've been doing, maybe 1 or 2 a week, kind of throughout the world. And by far, I listened to this, and people had contacted me and said, wow, that was really a terrific podcast. And the credit goes to Larry, for facilitating that and for what he brought to that. He has, I think, 25 years of martial arts experience, so has a deep depth of knowledge and situational awareness, which of course is in my wheelhouse, working with safety. So it was a natural fit that we were able to bridge off a number of scaffolds to support our main discussion on safety. So again, it is the Readily Random podcast. You can go to readilyrandom.com, listen to the shows that Larry has. And again, he puts a lot of time and effort into being very thorough. There's shows that I download and listen to. He has, I think this week coming up, someone in law enforcement specifically who works with visual identification of quote unquote tells that people give, and also co-authored a book with poker, having to do with watching what the opposition is doing. Like where their hands are positioned, any pattern behaviors they're doing, where their eyes are looking at certain times, and all of the nonverbal communication. And I've done some presentations on that, some professional presentations on that. Now I had to research it, and my presentations were very kind of entry level. It was something fascinating. I remember in my research that if you were to give somebody bad news, there was actually a better side to do that from. Again, it's either left or right. I don't know. I don't have the research available immediately in front of me, but there was actually a side that if you were on the one side of a person, when you delivered this news to them, they handled it better than if you were on the other side, because of the way that the brain would process. And I mean, it was just amazing. Now, the guest that Larry is going to have on, has extensive training and, of course, has published in this area, so far beyond anything that I've done. But the work that I did in that really was fascinating. So I'm certainly going to be tuning into that show, which will be number 15 on the Readily Random readilyrandom.com. It'll be episode number 15 for the law enforcement professional who's going to talk about the quote unquote the tells. So really enjoyed that show. It's delivered at Larry, first of all, excellent job editing. It's about 50 minutes long, delivered at a fast but very I guess fun, entertaining pace. We cover a ton of information. And it's one of those things, I always appreciate when I can go back and listen to a podcast and I learn something from it too. That it's just not information I'm putting out. It's information then that the person who is hosting the show is very astute to bring in new information and personal experiences. So, I mean, I really learned much from the show. You will too. So again, check out readilyrandom.com. And I strongly suggest, it's one of the podcasts I follow. I go in and I download. I do every week. You guys know it. Okay. The Safety Doc. I don't watch this about the safety. I don't watch TV. I don't listen to the radio. I'm not into any of that mainstream rhetoric-filled hype, in all the media and things that just have to be produced for mass scale. I go in and I pick out my content that I want to listen to each week. I do my research. You're not going to find me on Facebook and things like that. You'll find me on Twitter and I've got the webpage and stuff like that. But I go out and I find very solid content, which informs me, makes me better. And I think that's what you do when you listen to this show. I mean, we've had phenomenal numbers for the Safety Doc show in the last month. So we continue this upward trend, but we're well over 100,000 Twitter impressions, which is a record for June. We're smashing records on downloads of episodes. Things are really taking off. So definitely, I appreciate all of you. The audience is rooting, for this. And when you're done listening to a show like this, you can have a discussion with somebody and you can share some new information. And it's also going to help you with introspection and the way that you safely handle life every day and keep the lives of those around you, of your loved ones, safe. So, hey, you know what? Contact me if you are interested in being a guest on the podcast, or if you would like to have me be a guest on your podcast. Feel free to contact me. You can find me at SafetyPhD on Twitter, or else just go to safetyphd.com and my contact information is there. So today, again, we are talking about what one question predicted emotional breakdown better than any other. This comes out of a study by John Apple, a military psychiatrist. A lot of this is going to come from kind of World War I and World War II. I have looked at subsequent, articles and studies to also scaffold this to present day. So for those of you who weren't aware, June 27th was National PTSD Awareness Day, or Post-Traumatic Stress Disorder Awareness Day in the United States. That's rather recent. I think it was 2014 that officially became PTSD was given an awareness day. So I listened to an interview that was done, I think it was 2014, with President George W. Bush, and I was amazed. I think it was, let me see, it was on Good Morning America. They had a discussion, and I was really moved by his passion and the work that he has done in helping veterans readjust to life post-military. And I think again, it's one of those things where I will honestly say that my perception of him, of President George W. Bush, changed after that interview. Not that I had this negative perception, but it was just listening solidly for an hour of a man talking about his passion to help soldiers. I mean, on a grassroots level, to actually get to know them. And through his organization, it is the George W. Bush Institute. It's the Military Service Initiative of the George W. Bush Institute. So there's a number of stories of getting to know soldiers that have returned from combat, and what President Bush, and again, this was such a genuine, it was just like listening in on a conversation of someone, the passion and the knowledge and just his warmth and dedication to doing this was, it really was moving. I listened to it a few times, and anyway, if you have an opportunity, go in and Google, President George W. Bush and his PTSD presentation on Good Morning America. I think that was a couple of years ago, but again, yeah, it was 2014. But anyway, what the president had said is, let's get rid of the D. So instead of post-traumatic stress disorder, let's change it to post-traumatic stress injury. And the reason he said that, he said, I'm quoting, is we're getting rid of the D. He said, PTS is an injury. It's not a disorder. The problem is when you call it a disorder, veterans don't think they can be treated. So again, really moving for me, and I would agree. I think the term PTSD and even this PTSD Awareness Month, we've evolved beyond that. So instead of, again, PTSD, I think it's I would refer to it as post-traumatic stress injury. I would, and that's, that's going to be exactly how I will refer to it ongoing, disorder versus injury. And I think that is a very appropriate way to describe that. So I'm going to talk today about some important military psychiatric information that came out of World War II, also World War I. And some of these things are going to really surprise you, okay? And I did some research. So I have several pages of documents in front of me. I did a lot of research to develop this discussion. And I learned a lot, folks. I mean, I didn't know a number of these things that I'm going to share with you. And I'm going to point those out as we go on. And I think your awareness of these is going to be eye-opening too, especially if you have relatives who have served in the military. I have a neighbor who served in Iraq, several tours early in the Iraq War, this helps me better to understand when he returned his adjustment back into, I guess, a non-combat, scenario, and then helping to give me a better context for kind of identifying maybe some of the things that he went through. I know firsthand it was a tough transition back for him. So anyway, let's talk. So there is an important lesson that came out of military psychiatry in World War II. In World War II, looking at psychiatric collapses of individuals, okay, primarily on the Western Front, the conventional view was that there was something wrong with those soldiers before they even showed up in the Army, and that a healthy individual could endure combat essentially indefinitely and then, people had referred to that as shell shock early on, and later as combat fatigue. But so let's talk about this. Okay. So you're saying, that combat fatigue is a manifestation of a pre-existing condition in a military context. So basically, if you suffer combat fatigue, that condition was inherent to you from the day you were born. Okay. And the military had, during World War II, World War I, but more in World War II, extensive screeners to try to prevent people from entering the military that they felt would not be able to hold up to the psychiatric themed rigors of war. And basically, if you did succumb to combat fatigue, then it was just the fact that you got through this screening process undetected, that this was there all along. So so let's look at that, and this is really, I don't know. I look at this and the belief, okay, flat out, folks, the belief during World War II was a weakling soldier, one who hadn't been screened out, just needed, more motivation on, like, here is why you are fighting this war. And we can motivate you to see the purpose and overcome, your anxiety or this combat fatigue or whatever. It's just a matter of motivation. You're just not motivated to fight. And also they're viewing this as, this pre-existing condition. Like if you quote unquote cracked, I'm using some of these terms. I'm not trying to be disrespectful. That is not the intent at all. I'm being very much talking about the moment of what the perceptions were. If you cracked, it was a flaw within you. It was a flaw within the person. It wasn't a flaw within the system. It wasn't the fact that you were in such a chaotic, sustained, aggregate days of combat. It wasn't anything to do with that, okay? Although it really was, but the perception was, nope, this was a flaw within the person. This was a person that should never have passed through the screening process. Somehow they did, and now they, have combat fatigue. So here's what the military did. So obviously this flaw within a person, later was proven to be a false premise. But so what the military did in World War II is their approach to this, because you had a lot of very anxious soldiers and a lot of soldiers who were entering, you're talking about, 18, 17, 18, 19-year-old young men, stateside, and then they get thrown into heavy combat situations. And just the change in that from, we talked about earlier the Taurus, okay? And in I think the previous podcast, we talked about the Taurus of kind of your day to day, so these might have been, young men who would have gotten up, milked cows, done chores and whatever, and, had a day to day routine, and all of a sudden that's gone, and you're exiting out of that into kind of chaos until you settle maybe somewhat into a new Taurus or a new routine, which in and of itself is much, there's much more variation in that and much more chance for that at any one moment to flip into a chaotic situation. So what did the military do? So World War II, okay? And they're realizing, we have a lot of soldiers who the motto is more or less, I'll go if I get drafted. Like, I'll go if I have to go. So this is, from the psychiatrist, John Apple. He was talking about, let's do more propaganda. Okay. So as a psychiatric liaison to the information and education, i.e. I&E division, interesting information and education, really, probably more, not information education as much as propaganda and motivation. So he's saying, I took on my first project, helping make 5 movies in a series entitled Why We Fight, to be shown to recruits. So I went on YouTube, and you can do this. go onto YouTube and just type in "Why We Fight" plus World War II. You'll find these Frank Capra videos. Now, Frank Capra, was like the Steven Spielberg of the present. So just a very established film producer, and so you can see these videos, these series of videos, and they're about 40 to 50 minutes in length. And what they do is basically say, and they're scary. I mean, if you watch them today, and imagine you don't have the context. So this is, World War II. You don't have the context of having the internet available and TV, and media. And not that TV and media is going to give you a rich experience of the world, but, what you're being shown in these videos might be the first knowledge you really have of like what Japan is, or Italy, or Russia, Germany, whatever it might be. So it's, again, Why We Fight, and it's very, very, strongly put together. So, to try to motivate you, and to basically, lay out this rationale for, if you don't rise to this occasion, the country is going to fall, and this is what it's going to be like. And, so anyway, Dr. Apple said, I recall discussing id, superego, and ego with the experts making the films, a Harvard professor of sociology, a professor of psychology from Yale, and Ted, I think it's Giselle, Geisel, or Dr. Seuss. Again, Dr. Apple quoting, I said that the soldier's superego would tell him it was his duty to fight. His ego would convince him fighting was a good idea, and his id would arouse his emotions, his fear, his anger. Thus did Sigmund Freud enter the fray on the American side. We enlisted the help of Hollywood, and the films were made and shown throughout the Army. So again, go in, folks, and do a YouTube search and check some of these things out. In modern day, to watch these are absolutely frightening. And then try to place yourself back into literally, like a 18-year-old, on a farm, raised on a farm in rural America, and going to the theater and seeing one of these videos, just the impact that might have. It's really frightening. And I think we overlook how the American propaganda system, really got into play, heavy during World War II. And, it reminded me a lot of a couple movies. One was Rambo. So we all, well, not all, but I mean, for those of us that had watched Rambo with Sylvester Stallone, that was a movie where it was definitely portrayed as West versus East, in some regard. And also the movie, and this one I had just viewed recently again, because I had seen an interview with Dolph Lundgren. Dolph Lundgren played Ivan Drago in Rocky IV. So Rocky IV was, Rocky versus the Russian Ivan Drago. And Dolph Lundgren was 28, and I think it was like his first big movie role at that time. And so anyway, I mean, you watch that movie, and it certainly is very much just portraying, America against the U.S. in the 80s. I mean, even to the fact that they had a pseudo Gorbachev, the Russian, leader Gorbachev, portrayed in this, and how Rocky somehow, through his grit and determination and willpower is able to overcome this, what seemingly would be a superior, unable to defeat opponent. And yeah, it's really strange to watch that, because obviously that movie was designed to, help propagate, the American, position of preserving the country and, using tax dollars, supporting military efforts during the Cold War, and portraying, Russia as, because Ivan Drago, they're showing Rocky training out in some farmhouse, lifting rocks and chopping down trees and running through like heavy snow in like Siberia or somewhere. And Drago's like running on an indoor track and getting steroids and all this stuff. I mean, it's just so stereotyped. But I can tell you, I think every man, okay, I'll just speak from the man perspective on this, but every man who left the theater after watching Rocky IV, in the 80s, like you'd be invincible. You would think you're invincible for probably like, at least a few hours. I mean, you walk out of there. And even today, when I train, I will play. When I say train, I mean, if I'm doing, some bench presses or things like that, like I'll throw on the Rocky IV fight, montage, and which is like 10 minutes long. And it's got all of the, powerful music and the announcers and all of that stuff. And I'll kind of let that go for that 10 minutes, if I'm doing bench presses or something like that, because, kind of fires me up a little bit, just the effect it's supposed to have. But yeah, so Rocky IV, every man leaves the theater thinking like, I can go out there and I can do anything. The problem is that boost is tempered quickly by reality, just as these videos, these Frank Capra videos during World War II, the propaganda of like, again, the Why We Fight video series. And again, we know those things don't last. They get you, they would get people, these 18-year-olds into recruitment offices, and they would also see, hopefully not only their purpose, but then, the glorified, the medals, the ribbons, the things like that. So yeah, like I can leave Rocky and I can maybe go to rec league basketball that night and think I'm going to be awesome and score like 25 points. And then after, my second turnover 2 minutes into the game, I realize, hey, that's done. But let's talk about, the theme of this. So what one question, okay. So again, we started this out. What one question predicts emotional breakdown better than any other question? So these are the questions that they ask. Again, let's talk about World War II when they're having military recruits and they're asking them. I mean, they're asking them all kinds of questions like, do you bite your fingernails? Like 17% said yes and stuff like that, But later studies determined that the single question asked at induction, do you want to be in the service? Do you want to be in the service? Predicted actual emotional breakdown better than any other. Okay? That one question, do you want to be in the service? Negative responses heralded subsequent mental disorder. So basically, if you said, yeah, I want to be here, and your response wasn't, well, if I have to go, I have to go, or whatever, or that you had to be convinced. No, it's like, do you want to be in the service? If it's yes, that was a better predictor of how people would do as far as emotional endurance during the war. So interesting, that one question. So really, I mean, if you're answering no to that and you're giving reasons, the likelihood is those negative responses were going to manifest in you weren't going to do well on the battlefield. So we talked about John Apple. At that time, he was a young psychiatrist, and he opted to be attached to the Fifth Army. So the process during World War I and World War II was if you would have battle fatigue or quote-unquote shell shock, in modern day we would say post-traumatic stress injury, you would then go to a hospital and receive treatment. What actually John Apple did was one of the first psychiatrists to get out in the field, attach himself to that Fifth Army in World War II. that Fifth Army started, and you start to get the data, and they had this metric of what's called aggregate combat days, or ACD, aggregate combat days. So basically, like how many days aggregate would be total that you had been in combat. And this is really important as we get into this in the next minute. How many days could someone sustain themselves in combat? And the Fifth Army was very much an overfought army in North Africa and Sicily. So if you were in the Fifth Army in that campaign in North Africa and Sicily, it was really, really challenging. So Dr. Apple found that the number of aggregate combat days for the Fifth Army was 238. And after 238 days, so you're talking per soldier, okay? So if you're a soldier, you're in the infantry, you are in that Fifth Army in North Africa and Sicily. After 238 days, nobody's left, or they're dead. So here's basically what happens. After 238 days, aggregate combat days, you're either a physical casualty, you're a prisoner of war, or you're a psychiatric casualty. So the other point is everybody has a breaking point. Everybody has a breaking point. And there were not exceptions really to this rule. There weren't exceptions to this rule. And 238 was like the top. I mean, once you got up around over 200, your likelihood of either physical casualty, POW, or psychiatric casualty was very, very high. But that the peak you could kind of get to was 238. I mean, so anyway, what did we learn? Everyone is finite, and sooner or later the system will break. You can have guys that have held up magnificently, and they just get to the point where the voltage in the batteries is gone. So the other thing was, if you're 25 years old and you've been in combat for a couple of years, that was ancient. 25-year-olds would say things, and they would call it the old Sarge syndrome. And again, old Sarge could be 25 years old. So imagine a 25-year-old saying to the psychiatrist, saying, you know what? I'm the last old man left in my platoon, and there's only 2 of us old men left, and they're no better off than I am. You'll be seeing them soon. Wow. Dr. Edward A. Strecker served as a frontline psychiatrist in World War I, and he said a lesson learned there. So now we're going back to World War I, was that whereas in peacetime, abnormal men break down from normal stress. In wartime, normal men break down from abnormal stress. Let's talk about that one more time. So basically, in World War I, Dr. Strecker is saying a lesson that they learned was in peacetime, abnormal men. So let's say, with schizophrenia, bipolar, whatever it might be, the diagnosis back in the time of World War I would have been much different than what it is today. But abnormal men break down from normal stress, could be just going, the different chores that you have to do if you're on a farm or if you're in a factory or whatever, family stress. But in wartime, normal men, you're talking, farmers, factory workers, people that had, worked in schools, whatever, break down from abnormal stress. What is abnormal stress? It's having shells, bursting around you, and getting to the point where you, every crack of a branch, has your eyes wide open because you think it could be, an enemy looking to kill you. So, a big difference there. So, I had a discussion with Dr. Paul Rapp, and let me tell you about Dr. Paul Rapp. I learned about Dr. Rapp first by watching a Nova special on chaos theory, and made contact with him. And he has first of all, a phenomenal depth of credentials, and let me give those to you right now, just because I think this is important as I tell you more about my discussion with Dr. Paul Rapp. So he is the director of Traumatic Injury Research Program with the Department of Defense, Uniformed Services University. So he's worked in this capacity of studying, the psychiatric aspects and traumatic injury aspects of military for decades. And it really is one of the best in the world. Dr. Rapp said to me, he said, Dave, the ideal profile of a modern combat soldier today would be someone about age 40, good physical condition and with advanced education. He said, that's really good. If you're in a battle, you want somebody out there that has that profile. You want a number of people out there that have that profile, because they're typically going to be able to process very well what's going on around them, and they have a pretty high, survival and effectiveness rate. Now that's really interesting, because we know during World War I, I'm talking about these 17, 18, 19-year-olds that they get into combat, and if for some reason you can make it to 25, you have so many medals and ribbons, that it's adding another 10 pounds, to your wardrobe. Just the fact that you survive so many things in such a short amount of time. But this is very relative to on 9/11/2001, the Lord Manhattan boat rescue. Dr. Rapp and I talked about some factors that made that rescue very effective. The fact that 500,000 people were evacuated in 9 hours. How did that happen? And part of what contributed to that I think, that Dr. Rapp and I both agree on was, we looked at I looked at the demographics, and Dr. Rapp had some awareness already of the demographics, but a number of people who were rescued in that 500,000. Now, they're working in that financial district. So they're right around age 40. Whether they're in good physical condition or not, it's hard to say. But obviously, if you're commuting in and out and just the health of people today, you'd say if you're 40, probably pretty good condition for what you would have needed to do for your being a participant in a rescue on 9/11. And they would have had advanced education. So you would have had enough of those people present to bring order to that situation, that they would have maintained their cognitive processing and their conscious processing of, okay, I need to get to the harbor, to Battery Park, and, I'm going to wait in line, and eventually, it's going to be my turn to get on a boat, and I'm going to get out of here. So very, very fascinating that, we look today, and as Dr. Rapp was saying, you want out on that battlefield, you want some soldiers, who are around that age 40 mark with advanced education. That's a very stabilizing, it has a very stabilizing impact on your fighting force. So, let's think about that, and I don't know how that exactly relates to post-traumatic stress injury. Because it kind of seems counterintuitive. I just said, well, if you've been in for so long in the military that you only have so many aggregate combat days, and you probably have some cumulative stress, that injury that's going to be taking place. But actually, what we see today is different kind of than what we had seen during World War II. I guess we're seeing a more, for age, we're seeing a mix with an older population of soldiers. When I say older, I'm saying in the 40s, well, or age 40, probably mirroring a little bit more toward maybe what was back in the Civil War versus what was back in World War I, maybe World War II. So, anyway, remember that 238 number, aggregate combat days that I talked about? If you made it to the 238, you were almost guaranteed that you were a physical casualty, prisoner of war, or psychiatric casualty. So a subsequent survey found that the medical and line officers were in unanimous agreement that by the time a man had served 200 to 240 aggregate days of combat, he was ineffective. Okay. So again, if he had not, quote unquote, cracked up, he was so jittery under shell fire and so overly cautious that in addition to being ineffective as a soldier, he demoralized the newer men. So if you're coming into this, imagine, you're a new soldier deployed, at the time of World War II. And this 238 number, kind of still we're saying this still holds true today. But imagine you're being deployed and someone has had 200, days of aggregate, combat, meaning that every day, there's mortars and you have to be hyper vigilant because you're basically under attack every day. But I mean, you might have some breaks within that, but for the most part, you have this 200 aggregate days of combat. Once you hit that, you're ineffective. Because you get fairy jitter. Imagine coming in and seeing that, like you're coming in and you're looking at the people, who have participated, for a year or two in battle and they are just a mess. I mean, that has got to destroy your confidence. It was fascinating during the 9/11 rescue that once the rescuers, the firemen largely, you come to the Twin Towers and there's nothing you can do, at the point of once you had, your collapse and so forth, and you have firefighters and they are basically sitting down. I mean, at that time, the situation is still, it's very unstable. You can't just rush in and start pulling, debris out and things like that. I mean, now you have to have a coordinated effort of structural engineers coming in, telling you where you can go, where you can't go. And once people saw firefighters, and this, I have this from somebody that I spoke to who personally interviewed firefighters, that responded to 9/11. And once you had firefighters who would, take off their gear and sit because there wasn't anything at that moment they could do, that if you're there watching that, it's like, oh my goodness, what does this mean for me? And then people really became anxious and demoralized because, here you see the firefighters and there's nothing that they can do. Not that they didn't do tons, because they obviously did. But again, once the buildings collapse, you have to step back and have a perimeter, and now you have to have structural engineers come in, and you just can't rush firefighters back in to that because you don't know what you're dealing with as far as their personal safety. So, but yeah, if you watch that, you're used to seeing firefighters. I had a friend. And let me bridge a story off a little bit. I had a friend who had his barn burned down a few years ago and lost a number of cattle. And I remember, he waited and his family, for the fire department to arrive. And when the fire department arrived, they wouldn't, do much to suppress the fire because there were still live electrical cables on the property. And this was so demoralizing for my friend and for his family. And they actually, they went and manually shut off some of these power lines, but still, until the power company said it was safe, which was the complete correct protocol for the fire department. But you can see these resources there to try to help out, and yet you can't access these resources because the situation hasn't been secured. So what helped? So you talk about these soldiers. What helped? You have this 200 day that you could be in combat, and then after that, it was you were either headed quickly toward physical casualty, prisoner of war, or psychiatric casualty. So what helped? And it wasn't money. It wasn't money. What helped is this is strange, folks, but a few things. One is they set the completed tour of duty to 100 aggregate days, and then they gave points for rotation. So if you're close to the fighting, you get more points. You're rotated out. So if you're in the States, it used to be like if you're in the States and if you were actually at the front, you kind of got the same points, which wasn't fair, obviously. And they changed that. So they made it up to 180 days. So finally, soldiers could also see an end. Otherwise, it was just like, I'm going to be here until, one of these three things happens: a physical casualty, a POW, or psychiatric casualty. So the 180 days are earning your points. The other thing, think about this. There was a special big blue patch given to infantry soldiers that they wore, which signified that you were an infantry. It was a badge of honor. It was a marker of honor. And, you have things like that today. The whole video game industry is built about earning levels and badges and points. And actually they go to that in schools and so many industries and things like that. But people really, really get into this psychologically of earning these badges, these tokens. And this did a lot for the infantry soldiers. It actually got to the point where soldiers and other combat units, such as artillery, wanted these badges for themselves. Military was saying, no, they're for the infantry. And if you want one, transfer to the infantry. Some did, just for that. So yeah, giving that big blue patch, and what that then meant to those infantry soldiers. I mean, it was this marker of honor. So I think there's something very fundamental here to what humans perceive as badges. And we've seen that too in how schools retain teachers, giving them different kind of, quote unquote, even, badges or levels of attainment and even pins to wear and things like that. I've seen totally irrational motivators, in schools, for example, such as a traveling trophy of a stuffed animal, which might be the school mascot. And it can go around, every month to somebody that has done something deemed, exceptional or whatever. And how people will work and do and promote themselves and once they get that, how it is this kind of puffing up of the chest or whatever for this recognition. And I'm not saying this is necessarily bad, but the reality is it's a traveling trophy. I mean, it has no intrinsic value. It means nothing. It has no extrinsic value. I mean, maybe it has intrinsic value, but it means nothing. It's just like the patch. It means nothing. The medals, it means nothing. But there is this very strong laminating effect, meaning that you laminate your identity to these external things. Like someone who says, I am an engineer. Tell me about yourself. And someone says, I am an engineer at Boeing. That's different than saying, I enjoy hiking and I really am into, science and physics. And, I also, I've got 2 kids and I work at Boeing. Well, right there, I mean, you've talked a lot about yourself and your interests and things like that versus like, I am an engineer at Boeing. So this people laminating to their identities. And I think I talked about it in an earlier podcast, but it's not uncommon for, someone who's been at a work, in a work position for a number of years, that if they get laid off from that position or terminated from that position, transferred, whatever, they can have a psychological breakdown, or even an attempt or completed suicide. It's happened on a pretty regular basis. So, I think it's important to know if you're being manipulated by something that is essentially meaningless. So if someone, gives me, a certain, badge to wear or whatever, because I don't, like if I get the podcasting, badge of honor or whatever, and I don't know. I've never been, like you can look back me. I have a doctoral degree from University of Madison, which I'm proud of for the fact that I put a ton of rigor into that, really pushed myself and got to work with an exceptional faculty of world-class professionals that pushed me, to learn more about myself than I think I ever knew I was capable of doing. But the degree itself, that piece of paper, doesn't define me. You're not going to see it in the back. You're going to see some changes back there because I'm updating. But no, I don't need that to define me. I don't need that to define me. But the psychological effect of laminating people, and this still happens today, with certain badges and things like that the military has found very, very effective, especially with younger recruits. So, from a medical viewpoint, okay, this is from the article, the John Apple article. From the medical viewpoint, the most exciting event that had, the most exciting event had been the discovery that every man had a breaking point. So it wasn't that you had this internal psychological defect if you somehow had if you broke down. The fact was every man had a breaking point. All of us, you and I, everybody has a breaking point. Everybody has a breaking point. Doesn't matter. This had not been previously known to psychiatry or to anyone. So this is rather new. World War I, World War II, the fact that everybody has a breaking point. And looking at this differently, and I go back to how President Bush, works with post traumatic stress injury. That everybody has this breaking point. So, and I see that too in work that I do as a critical incident debriefer. But what an evolution that we've made as a society to look at things differently here in the last, 50, 60 years as a defect within the person if there was a psychiatric breakdown, to the fact that everybody has a breaking point. And it's not that you somehow got through school. No, everybody has it. And you get to that 238 days of aggregate combat. That's it. So thank you for listening to the Safety Doc podcast. Listen on the 405 Media out of Los Angeles, California. Show is available YouTube, SoundCloud, Apple Podcasts. Please subscribe. You can follow me at SafetyPhD on Twitter, at SafetyPhD. Visit www.safetyphd.com, safetyphd.com to learn more about me and the shows. We do one show per week, and lately I've been a guest on a number of shows. Please check out, please subscribe. Thank you very much.